senior software engineer at Java. I've been working in the software industry for more than 27 years and seen many companies and projects struggle with keeping up with library maintenance. It doesn't matter how big the project is or the environment it is written in. If a project is more than a year old, it likely will have out-of-date libraries, and if it allows that condition to continue, suffering will happen. I'm here today to talk about the challenges and strategies companies and other groups writing software, either commercial, in-house, or even large open source efforts, face trying to stay current with the open source libraries they use in their offerings. Let me just begin sharing. Put my smiling face up here. Alrighty. Before I get into it, I want to state that as software developers, we all have a huge debt of gratitude to those who write and maintain open source software, i.e. most of you. Although keeping up with maintaining our library versions is tough, having to write all that code ourselves would be much tougher. Java relies on open source software from all sorts of sources, from companies providing their APIs as open source, such as Stripe, to companies writing and finding ways to make a business in open source, like Cube.js, to pure open source projects like Rails. Thank you. Since I'll be using Java as my primary example, I should give a quick introduction to what Java is. Java is a software as a service company that helps home service businesses deliver their services and interact with customers. The software manages the full customer lifecycle, from generating quotes to scheduling crews, invoicing customers and accepting payments, either in person or online. We even provide an API so third parties can extend Java. Java is used in 50+ industries, including landscaping and lawn care, HVAC, residential cleaning, painting, and more, and is a platform of record for 160,000+ service pros, powering long-standing family businesses and young entrepreneurs alike. With all that we offer, we directly depend on more than 500 open source libraries between our web and mobile applications. These 500 libraries bring in an additional 6,000 transitive dependencies. Given average library update rates, this would result in us having between 25 and 50 libraries to update each month if we wanted to stay current with each patch release. That's too much. Now, some of these updates are small, some are large, some are critical. Many bring nothing new to the table for us at the moment, sorry to say. So how do we decide when to keep up? In a perfect world, small changes should be caught by our automated testing. We expect that large changes need manual testing over and above the automated testing. Assuming the library maintainer is using Semver, then we should be able to easily determine the scope of the change. Sadly, not all libraries follow Semver. And then there are the bad actors out there. These days, even the library maintainers can't be trusted, some turning to hacktivism of their own libraries, sadly, sometimes with unintended bad consequences. This means we need to give attention to every update. And yet, our business is not about updating libraries. We have features to write and code to enhance. There's a continuous tension in prioritizing library maintenance versus new work. Excuse me. So what approaches are there to keeping up? Here are the most common ones I've seen to date. Don't have a formal approach. Just update libraries when there's pain. Or give it all to one team. Or have a maintenance day or week on some regular cadence, say quarterly. And then finally, distribute library maintenance across most, if not all, of your teams. Now I'll go into some of the approaches in more detail. Do nothing and wait for the pain. This is the first and simplest, and honestly probably the best choice for when a project is starting up. Let's face it, if we consider significant tech debt to be when a library is more than one major version behind, which is part of my definition, I'll come to that later, then for the first 2 years, assuming you start with current libraries, you're unlikely to get into serious tech debt. Just watch for security alerts from things like GitHub's Dependabot or Tidelift. Stay up to date on security and watch for new features in the libraries you use. You are probably okay. Here are some of the common pain points you hit if you're waiting for pain. The security issue, obviously. Something breaks and you need a new version of the library to fix it. Some new features added to the library that you want. So what happens if we keep up with this wait for pain approach too long? The biggest issue tends to be significant upgrade effort. You've let a library mature for a couple years and moved through a couple major releases, which, assuming they're following Semver, means breaking changes. Chances are you now have to deal with a bunch of breaks. And the more releases you are behind, the harder it may be to tease out these breaks. Another big gotcha that happens with this approach, if left too long, is inopportune security fixes. Your team is rushing to complete something, and suddenly a critical security fix is released, but it is not on a major version you're on. Now, provided you are impacted right now by the security issue, you should refocus some effort on upgrading the library that would really be better used elsewhere, given some time constraint you're currently under. And then there are other surprises. When Apple's supply chain moved to ARM Max somewhat abruptly, we were caught off guard by the number of libraries we were using that simply would not work under ARM, even with Rosetta, which in theory is a backwards compatibility tool Apple provides and is generally good, but not 100% satisfactory. Fortunately, we already had scheduled and started upgrading Node, which was a big part of the problem, and it addressed a large number of the issues. So we didn't get burned horribly, but we were definitely taken aback by the challenges we faced. So another option is assigned to one team. This certainly works, but can be a tough sell to the developers. Most developers do not want to be solely on maintenance when new features are being developed by other teams. Another challenge is that this one team needs to have a solid understanding of the whole code base so that the team can meaningfully estimate the impact of a library change, and when breaking change happens, they can effectively deal with the issue. Doable on a small group effort with a small code base, but certainly as the code base grows, this becomes much more of a challenge. A variant of this is to rotate library maintenance duty between teams. This alleviates the problems of developers not wanting to be stuck on the maintenance team. They see that everybody will be eventually stuck on it, but it makes everything else worse. All of the learnings you get from doing library upgrades are lost as you move from team, as a new team takes over the effort. Then there's have a regular maintenance day. Pick a cadence and have everyone do maintenance. Yeah, it sounds nice, except major upgrades can take more than a day to do, maybe even more than a week. Leadership is not likely to appreciate you coming to them asking for a maintenance month. And as your product grows, the frequency has to grow to keep up. Finally, this doesn't address the surprise, we need to upgrade now times. Finally, there's distributed the work across most, if not all, teams. I'm making an assumption here that the project has enduring teams, meaning a team that fundamentally stays together for a long period of time and focuses on some specific areas of the feature set or code base. The primary benefit, provided enduring teams, is that the assigned team is in the best position to understand the impact of a change and the level of manual testing necessary. Additionally, libraries often have upgrade quirks that appear over and over again. Once a team has updated a library once, they have learned the quirks for that library and can reapply the learning next time. If you, excuse me. If you don't have enduring teams, then there's still a win that everyone spends some time on library maintenance, similar to distributing to rotating amongst teams, but the win isn't as big. The primary challenge with distribution is keeping track of what team owns what and what work they have to do. This is the approach we've landed on at Jobber. The rest of this talk will describe it in more detail. But before I get there, here are some important things to keep in mind regardless of approach. Unless you have no libraries that are out of date, you need to decide which ones to focus on. Prioritizing them is valuable, but how do you prioritize? Security issues. Always stay on top of security issues. Earlier, I suggested that if it isn't impacting you right away, you don't need to, but that's not true. Even if you are not currently impacted by the issue, who knows what some future team will start doing next, which suddenly exposes a problem. Next come major releases. These should be a top priority. Falling behind on these is when you tend to get surprised by unexpected big work due to breaking changes. Minor releases. Try to stay no more than X behind. Choose an X, where I believe we set ours at 10 at this point. Again, if you get too far behind, the surprise factor of extra work can hit you. Usually, new feature work is more valuable than directly tracking every minor release. But look for features and bug fixes. Minor releases are there for a reason. And then there's the patch release. We consider these last. It's almost always a case that working on new features or other development work is more valuable than staying up to date with every single patch release, unless something the patch does is directly impacting you, of course. So the first thing to do, obviously, is assign ownership of libraries to teams. For many of the libraries, this will be obvious. The services the library provides will be used in one team's area of focus, and only that team, or primarily that team. For other libraries, there may be no clear choice. Maybe it's a cross-cutting library. Maybe it's just a library that is kind of core to the system and isn't clearly used specifically by one team. The best answer I've come up with is simply roll the die. Randomly give it to some team. But try and keep in mind balancing library ownership so that no one team has too many active libraries. When I say active libraries, I mean libraries that are undergoing frequent development. There are libraries out there that are mature and only see a few updates a year, maybe. Fine to get lots of those to a specific team because they're not going to be burdened by that. And also remember that this doesn't need to be static. It's best not to move library ownership frequently as you lose the benefits of teams' experience updating that library, but it will make sense from time to time as teams' area of focus change or their workloads change. Now comes the question of how to actually track that ownership. We like to keep tracking the ownership close to where the libraries are defined. So for the gem files we use, we were able to create a custom command that replaces the standard gem command. It takes ownership as the first parameter. This makes it obvious to developers when they come in here to add a new library that they need to define a team to own that library, most likely their own team. Quick small side note if you look at the names here. At Jobber, we often have multiple teams working on an area of focus. So we're not actually assigning to specific teams, we are assigning to areas of focus. This has the same benefits as teams stay on an area of focus for an extended time. It has the added benefit that we potentially can assign a library update to any team in that area of focus. For NPN, we didn't come up with as elegant a solution. We keep the ownership information in the same file, so it's all in one place-ish, but it's in a separate section, and the sections are long. So it does increase the risk that a library will be added without ownership. But I'll show you how we are alerted to that condition later. So here's the flow of how we identify out-of-date libraries. This works, everything I've outlined above works fine for direct dependencies of our offerings. But what about all those transitive dependencies, a 10-to-1 ratio for us, that get included? Fortunately, both gem files and npm provide tools to help us with this. Here's a full flow we created to find libraries that are out of date. First, we use open source tools called libyear bundler for the Rails code and libyear for the npm dependencies to find libraries that are out of date. Then we merge in any libraries reported as having security risks from Dependabot from GitHub. Next, we run bundle Y and npm list and the respective code bases to find the source of any transitive libraries. Finally, we use the ownership information shown previously to assign ownership. The parent libraries will have ownership in those files, and transitive libraries will percolate up to the parent file, including them, to find the ownership. This has been an automated process that we run nightly. And I should mention that we took a staged approach to assigning ownership. We didn't assign ownership to every single library we have directly dependent on. We waited until libraries had updates that needed addressing, and if that library was not yet owned by a team, we would give it ownership at that time. Allowed us to roll things out faster. Now we need to know what needs to be fixed. So of course we need to report it. The first form of reporting is to the team. Our code updates a Google spreadsheet nightly with the results from the previous steps. There are sorted tables for each team. I'll describe the sort order shortly. This makes it easy for us to see what needs to be worked on and then to get it scheduled into our backlogs. Here you see an example of what a team sees on their tab, at least most of it. There are some columns showing things like current version in code versus latest version, along with date info for currency of the library. But for clarity's sake of the image, I hid those. Troublesome values are highlighted, so it is easy to see what is to focus on. You'll see that anything that has a major release missing is going to be highlighted in red. Significant patch release age is highlighted as well. And just the age of the library. It is possible that a library is very mature and not moving quickly. We still want to at least look at that, and if something is 3 years out of date but only a couple patch releases, maybe it's worth keeping it updated anyway. And finally, in addition to these tables for the teams, there's a tab for unknown libraries. That's how we keep track of libraries that we have not yet assigned ownership to, or new libraries that were added without ownership. Of course, management, and yes, I'm with them on this, data is king, wants easily consumable trend lines and reporting. Here you see a graph reporting the overall state of one of our offerings. It represents the number of libraries that are 3 or more years out of date, those 2 years out of date, those 1 year out of date, and those with at least one minor version out of date. You'll note that I'm ignoring patch releases in this graph. That's just more data than the management needs to see. You'll also note there's the equation will drop down and up on this. Full disclosure, I suspect that's a bit of a bug in our code that sometimes misses a library dependency and then adds it back in that we haven't addressed yet. And here's a graph of something I call the one number. The stack graph previously was pretty good, but we want to see a single metric line that shows if we're trending up or down. It's the same weighted sum as those metrics, although I do include patch releases here. The value of this graph is it quickly and easily shows if a project is improving or getting worse in terms of keeping up with library maintenance. In theory, you could compare projects as well, but I find that a bit dangerous as different environments, different code bases, they just have different requirements on their libraries, so it can be a bit deceiving, as well as the maturity of the project is going to necessarily have an increasing impact on the out-of-dateness. Slight aside, why not use lib year, which is basically just an aggregate count of how many years behind you are? We found it didn't answer the question we were asking. Some libraries are pretty stable, as I mentioned before, and so maybe only see 1 or 2 patch releases a year, while others are very active and may see multiple major releases a year. Lib year counts 1 patch release in a year equal to 1 major release in that year. Since we wanted to represent effort to bring our libraries up to date, And from experience, the effort to update one patch release is significantly smaller than to update one major release. This wasn't meeting our needs. We're going to look a little bit deeper on the one number. Here's the actual weighting we found works best as the one number. It tends to cause the graph to move in meaningful ways as prioritized work is done on library maintenance. The logic behind the above numbers is that the further behind you are in library maintenance, the likely greater effort there will be to update a library. Hence, being more than 3 versions behind is very expensive. Updating a patch release should be relatively simple and so severely discounted. You'll likely notice that security issues are not recorded on the one number. We report on those differently, and that is out of scope for this talk. Suffice it to say that security issues are never allowed to linger. Last step after assigning ownership and creating these reports is to set targets. This is a final piece that helps us prioritize library maintenance with future work. If the targets for the period haven't been met, we need to do some more work. If they have been, then prioritize other work. Pick something that makes sense for you. You can be very aggressive or more relaxed, whatever is appropriate for the time, the level of maturity of the project and state it's in. And the targets can change over time as well. When you get started, chances are you've been doing the do nothing and wait for pain approach, so you have lots of libraries out of date. You maybe want to become a bit more aggressive, but then maybe relax things once things are under control. Our initial targets were for each area of focus to upgrade at least one library a quarter. Knowing that many library upgrades end up requiring additional libraries to also be upgraded, the expectation was we'd on average get 2 or 3 libraries upgraded by area of focus per quarter. Not a very fast pace, but a reasonable balance between library maintenance and future work. Security issues fall outside this target, sort of. They must be addressed. Ideally, they don't fall into the 1 library per quarter count so that we can continue to improve the status of our library maintenance. But if the security update ended up being a significant amount of work, then we're willing to credit it to this target. Some last thoughts. Well, I presented the last few items, reporting and targets, in the context of distributing library maintenance amongst all the teams. They really make sense regardless of approach. You don't want to be caught in blissful ignorance, except maybe waiting for pain. But even there, I'd argue blissful ignorance can be seen as just deferred pain. But in any other approach, you'll always want to have some appropriate reporting so you can see what state you're in, and targets will always help to one degree or another, depending on project, to keep things in check. All right, what have we seen today? I've laid out the scope of the problem, which is surprisingly large when we add transitive dependencies. I've gone over a number of approaches to library maintenance and discussed the pros and cons of each. And then I've gone deep into Jobber's approach. I'm sure it isn't perfect. We've only been using it for a little while now, and it will evolve. But to date, it seems like a good scalable approach that will ensure we continue to maintain our libraries amidst the tension of doing other work. Thank you. And now, if anyone has any questions.